Chapter 1: Before the Score. For most of film history, movies lived or died without a number attached to them. You didn't open an app and see 73% hovering over a poster like a warning label. You didn't know before buying a ticket whether a film was fresh, rotten, or something in between. You found out the old-fashioned way, from trailers, from word of mouth, from critics you trusted, or from sitting in a dark theater and making up your own mind. It meant walking into a movie without pre-approval. It meant critics arguing in newspapers instead of being averaged into silence. It meant studios releasing films that weren't instantly reduced to a verdict by lunchtime on opening day. Then, quietly, that changed. Rotten Tomatoes didn't just aggregate reviews. It introduced a new habit: checking first, not after, not during, before. And once audiences got used to that habit, there was no going back. A single percentage began to stand in for tone, quality, ambition, risk, and even cultural relevance. The score didn't explain why people disagreed, it just told you they did. Over time, that line hardened into something studios feared. Because Rotten Tomatoes started shaping behavior, audiences avoided movies preemptively. Studios rewrote, delayed, or quietly buried projects. Marketing campaigns were redesigned around one goal: protect the score at all costs. This wasn't censorship in the traditional sense. No one was banning films, but something subtler was happening. Risk was being priced out of the system. And once that happens, you don't just lose bad movies. You lose strange ones. You lose divisive ones. You lose the kind of films that split a room in half and then linger in culture for decades. So the question isn't whether Rotten Tomatoes is good or bad. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable. What kind of movie culture would exist if that score never showed up at all? Chapter 2: When studios started watching the score. The moment Rotten Tomatoes became unavoidable wasn't when audiences discovered it. It was when studios did. At first, it looked harmless, just a review aggregator, mostly used by movie nerds and critics themselves. But then executives noticed something unsettling. Opening weekend behavior started to line up with that little percentage, enough to scare people whose jobs depend on predictability. A movie could have a massive marketing push, a recognizable cast, and a familiar premise, and still flop if the score dipped below a certain threshold. Around the mid-50s, things got shaky. Below that, campaigns quietly changed tone. Ads emphasized spectacle instead of story. Some films were barely screened for critics at all. That wasn't an accident. Studios learned to treat Rotten Tomatoes like weather radar. If a storm was coming, you either rerouted the release or tried to outrun it. Sometimes that meant embargo strategies, sometimes it meant selective screenings, sometimes it meant releasing reviews as late as legally possible and hoping opening night momentum could overpower the number. But the bigger shift was philosophical. Greenlight meetings started including an unspoken question: what's the Rotten Tomatoes path for this? Or will critics broadly agree? Because Rotten Tomatoes measures consensus, not passion. A film that half the critics adore and half despise doesn't land in the middle culturally. But on Rotten Tomatoes, it does. That's how you end up with a system that quietly favors familiar genres, clean narratives, safe tones, easily defensible themes. Anything abrasive, ambiguous, or tonally weird becomes a mathematical risk. This is where the score starts influencing scripts before they're shot. Edges get sanded down in rewrites, endings are softened, characters become more likable, politics are diluted. Studios don't ask writers to make something better, they ask them to make it less objectionable. The irony is that many of the films we now call classics would struggle in this environment. They're messy, they're provocative, they make critics argue. But argument doesn't travel well when everything gets averaged into a percentage. And once that logic settles in, it spreads fast. Directors start internalizing it. Producers start anticipating it. Marketing departments start reverse engineering it. Even test screenings are interpreted through the lens of how a moment might play with critics. By the time a movie hits theaters, the score isn't reacting to the film anymore. The movie has already been reacting to the score. And that raises a bigger question. If Rotten Tomatoes disappeared tomorrow, would studios suddenly get braver? Chapter 3: What Audiences Lost Without Realizing It. The biggest change Rotten Tomatoes brought wasn't how movies were made, it was how people approached watching them. Before scores, going to the movies involved a small gamble. You chose based on a trailer, a poster, a vibe, or a recommendation from someone whose taste you trusted. Sometimes you won, sometimes you didn't, but even the losses were part of the experience. They helped you figure out what you liked and what you didn't. Rotten Tomatoes quietly removed that friction. Instead of asking, "Does this look interesting to me?" the question became, "Is this safe to watch?" And that shift sounds minor, but it isn't. A percentage doesn't tell you who liked a movie or why. It doesn't tell you whether the critics who hated it for reasons you might enjoy. It just gives you permission or takes it away. Over time, audiences learned to pre-filter their curiosity. Movies below a certain score stopped being worth a shot. Films that sparked strong disagreement were treated as mistakes rather than conversations. Even genuinely bold swings were dismissed before they had a chance to find their people. That's how cult movies used to be born, through friction. Through half the room loving something and the other half walking out confused or annoyed. Those movies didn't need consensus. They needed time. But Rotten Tomatoes collapses time. By opening night, a movie is already branded. And once that label sticks, it's hard to shake, even if audiences eventually respond differently. Streaming doesn't fix this either. In fact, it makes it worse. People scroll faster. They check scores faster. They bail faster. The algorithm doesn't ask you to trust your taste. It asks you to trust the crowd. That's not how taste develops. That's how it stagnates. There's also a psychological effect most people don't talk about. Watching a movie after seeing its score subtly changes how you experience it. You're primed. You're looking for the flaws or you're forgiving them. Either way, the film never gets a clean shot. You're not watching the movie. You're verifying the number. In a world without Rotten Tomatoes, audiences wouldn't magically become smarter or braver, but they would be more present, more willing to sit with discomfort, more open to movies that don't resolve cleanly or explain themselves politely. They'd argue more afterward, disagree more, recommend things more passionately. In other words, movie culture would feel messier and more alive. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of all this, because Rotten Tomatoes didn't just change studios and audiences, it changed critics themselves. Chapter 4: When critics stopped sounding like people. Before aggregation, a critic's power came from voice. You read Pauline Kael, Roger Ebert, or whoever your person was, not because they were right, but because you understood how they thought. You could predict when you disagree with them, and sometimes that made their recommendations more useful, not less. Their reviews existed as arguments, not votes. Rotten Tomatoes turned every review into a binary choice, fresh or rotten, thumbs up or thumbs down, and once that happened, the nuance stopped traveling. A 3-star review that says, "This is flawed but interesting," lands the same as a glowing rave that just barely clears the positivity line. A thoughtful, conflicted piece that wrestles with a movie's ambition gets flattened into a green splat or a red one. Over time, critics adapted. When your review is going to be reduced to a yes or no that contributes to a public score, the safest position becomes the most legible one. Instead of asking, "What is this movie trying to do?" the subtext becomes, "Does this movie deserve approval?" That's a very different mindset. One invites disagreement. The other discourages it. This is where you start seeing weird cultural distortions. Movies that are technically competent but emotionally empty rack up solid scores. Movies that are ambitious but uneven get punished. Anything that feels unfinished, abrasive, or morally unclear becomes radioactive. Not because it's bad, but because it's hard to rate cleanly. Critics didn't become less intelligent, they became more risk-averse. And when criticism becomes risk-averse, culture follows. Because studios, audiences, and algorithms don't read reviews anymore. They read the number. Critics know that. They feel that pressure, even if they'd never admit it. Their words still exist, but their influence flows through a percentage they don't control once it leaves their hands. The tragedy here isn't that critics lost power, it's that their individuality stopped mattering. In a world without Rotten Tomatoes, critics would still disagree loudly. They'd still be wrong sometimes, but those disagreements would be visible, not average out into a polite shrug, which leads to the final question: if Rotten Tomatoes vanished tomorrow, would anything actually change? Or has the industry already internalized the logic so deeply that the number doesn't even need to exist anymore? Chapter 5. After the number, what a world without Rotten Tomatoes might actually look like. If Rotten Tomatoes disappeared tomorrow, Hollywood wouldn't suddenly enter a creative renaissance. Let's be honest about that. Studios wouldn't wake up brave. Executives wouldn't greenlight 3-hour character studies out of nowhere. Algorithms wouldn't vanish. Risk aversion wouldn't evaporate overnight. But something would loosen, because the most powerful thing Rotten Tomatoes did was standardize taste. And once that standard disappears, even partially, the system starts feeling around in the dark again. In a world without the score, marketing would have to work harder. Trailers would matter more. Tone would matter more. Studios couldn't hide behind a percentage. They'd have to sell what a movie feels like, not how approved it is. Audiences, too, would recalibrate. People would still ask for recommendations, but they lean more on friends, creators, and critics whose taste they understand, not a floating average. Movies would have longer cultural tales. Some would fail loudly, then slowly find their audience later, instead of being declared dead by Friday afternoon. And criticism gradually get its texture back. A movie splitting critics wouldn't read as a warning sign, but as an invitation. This one might be for someone, just not everyone. That's the part we've lost. Rotten Tomatoes trained us to treat movies like consumer products with quality control stamps. And sure, that protects people from wasting money, but it also trains everyone, studios, critics, audiences, to optimize for approval instead of impact. A world without Rotten Tomatoes wouldn't be better because fewer bad movies exist. It would be better because more interesting ones could survive long enough to matter. Culture would feel less settled, less polite, less optimized. Messier, but that's kind of the point. Because art doesn't need consensus, it needs friction. And for the first time in a long time, that friction might actually be visible again.